Good afternoon and welcome to the third in the SunGuard 2020 webinar series on infrastructure as a service. And this one is entitled Self-Service versus Support. We're joined today by a panel of experts including George Christophe, Senior Cloud Consultant at SunGuard Availability Services, Karen Moss, Editor of Retail Systems, and Steve Badger, Cisco's expert in Service Catalogue and Automation Technologies. In terms of housekeeping, we'll have 20 minutes of discussion, followed by a 10-minute Q&A session during which our experts will be responding to questions from the audience. During the webinar, we'll be running an interactive poll, and today's question is, what is your primary concern about self-service provisioning? So let's begin. Self-service and automation can enhance the economies and efficiencies achieved in the cloud, but let's start by examining what does automation really mean? Is it an anonymous, faceless process? Or is there something else going on behind the scenes? George, perhaps you'd like to start us off.
Self-service automation really is a method that the customer can actually deliver and control their environment in a change control process automatically by either self-provisioning new servers or new resources or actioning any changes in their existing infrastructure. Whereas the manual support method entails a more traditional approach where there's a human interaction on the other end from the service provider or the partner with the customer to both provision necessary workloads for the customer, provision any certain security and network, etc., and also manage the change life cycle. So there's more of an assessment on impact. We've seen more customers within the development environment looking at more self-service methods at the moment, and people who use production systems traditionally go for something which is managed support on the end, where they're speaking to someone over the phone or any actions and changes are vetted through a process, a vigorous change control process as such. So they want to keep that actual functionality the same as what they currently use now and today.
So I think the level in which automation is used will depend largely on the service that the service provider or the enterprise is wanting to extol to their customer base. So if you take a pure infrastructure service as a public cloud provider might provide it would be highly automated, self-service to really reduce costs to meet that unit price level that needs to be met for that market. Or are you a Rolls-Royce provider where you're going to provide not only the infrastructure but the service and the change management and the security and all the service wrap that might go around that, additional services, backup and all those kinds of things, that obviously makes a much higher price point but a much higher level of quality of service to the customer as well, and maybe not quite so much automation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think from what I hear within the retail industry is that it is quite a fine balance. On one hand, retailers want a certain level of automation because they want to free up their IT teams to be able to focus on innovation within the company, and then on the other hand, they also want a level of service from their infrastructure provider, where they will be able to pick up the phone and call them at any time of the day or night and get somebody who's actually going to be accountable for the service and be able to provide them with an answer. And I think a really good example actually of a retailer who's used cloud technology really well is Domino's Pizza, and they've outsourced everything to the cloud, and they've been able to, their IT team has been able to focus on innovation. They've launched iPad apps, smartphone apps. They've got loads of cool features for those, like pizza tracker, where you can follow where your pizza, where it is along the delivery route and that kind of thing, and I think without outsourcing to the cloud and actually freeing up the team, it might not have been something that they would have accomplished so quickly. They've rolled it out really, really quickly.
Well, the cloud and automation, of course, can enable such services. They're very much flexible, on demand, because it gets away from the traditional methods of having to do the analyst work out what the business requirement is, purchase the equipment, host it, stage it. You can't do that kind of flexibility with those traditional methods, so it's an enabler. But we also need to be cognizant of the fact that it's a service as well as just a technical process. Yeah.
I think flexibility is very important to retailers. That's that scalability that cloud brings. The fact that they can ramp up their web capacity if they need to for a certain promotion or deal that they might be promoting through their website. if they're going to be getting a lot of traffic, it means they can do it overnight. It's an easy process.
Yeah, and as what you said there, Karen, there's certain times when companies need to ramp up that resource, and they can actually find it with a service provider where they can not only ramp up resources, but they can actually look into some monthly routines that they wish to burst out into every month, and work alongside a service provider to customise what they require, so the service provider knows what's coming every month as a standard, so to cater for it, not to affect anyone else also.
So self-service can help to align compute resource to the requirements of the business more directly. But presumably for customers who are embarking on their first foray into the cloud, they wouldn't go straight to a self-service environment.
Well, in my experience, I've seen a lot of customers who try the self-service portals out there to just use them in development. I'll just use them as a kind of a proof of concept as such. When it comes down to production systems at the moment, there's a lot of hesitancy with putting my production systems out into a self-service portal kind of environment, and they kind of want to speak to someone, they want a consultative engagement, they want to go through their business requirements, their resource requirements, have a design around what they actually really need and how best fits into their business. So
there's quite a number of situations where automation just means standardization, and there's certain things that can be standardized. Your first few steps into the cloud, things like test and development environments where you're standing them up and tearing them down on a regular basis. There's no real customer impact. You can stop with that. It's very easily standardized and therefore automated for that proof point. We see quite a number of customers doing that.
Yeah. I think for retailers at that first foray into infrastructure as a service, they do have some concerns. Some of the things that I hear are particularly around security and security of their data, where it's being held and how. I think that data is something that's very important to retailers. It's how they drive their loyalty programs and their marketing, and really how they have that touch point with their customers, and get to know them. Yeah, I think security is definitely an issue.
It is key, and a lot of customers do. That's one of the main questions they ask about. They also are concerned about where data is kept, and how things will work within their business, i.e. change management, etc. How a change will impact their infrastructure or others, or if others will impact them. So again, all these considerations are wanted to be kind of exhausted by customers by talking to someone on the other end. Sometimes a self-service portal will not assist them in convincing their management that this is the way to go.
And we have good processes. Most service providers follow ITIL processes for change and release management, and we shouldn't circumvent those with automation. We should add to the capability. Maybe we capture the requirement through the self-service portal and pass it off into a traditional change model that needs to go through a change advisory board. On the other hand, other changes might be pre-approved changes and might just go straight through the automation tools to drive efficiency and that price point that most customers would like to achieve.
So in fact, we're not really talking about unilateral provisioning. This is a process that's interrogated and validated before being executed. But on that basis, what kind of assurances should people looking at a self-service proposition, what kind of assurances should they seek from the service provider?
Well, with the service provider, they need to know that the service provider has the kind of consultative approach, as well as being able to provide them with a design and a support infrastructure which fits primarily around their business needs. So where traditional support within their companies themselves are working around ITIL processes, they need to make sure that the service provider who's interacting with them, who's actually going to be a partner, can kind of interlink with their business needs, not to be something totally different which they have to try to align to. Service providers really should align to business needs for different customers.
Yeah, I think it's really important that the service provider that a retailer chooses fits their business and will be able to deliver the benefits that they actually want, because infrastructure as a service is still relatively new and it's still evolving and changing. And I think there's a temptation sometimes to stick with a provider that you already use for another part of your business if they offer a cloud service, but that might not particularly suit their business model or deliver the benefits that they want. So I think that retailers need to be careful about who they choose.
Yeah, I think it depends on exactly what benefits you want out of this, and I think you put it very well around it's a partnership, a contract, you're working together. So we're seeing quite a number of different types of service providers. You've got the public cloud providers that are not going to provide you a great customer service like a Rolls-Royce service provider would, and a whole plethora of others in between, hosting providers that are turning into or providing an elastic service that retailers might already have, hosting services, they have processes and people that they trust, and that might make a good partnership for moving into more elastic on-demand type services.
Yeah, absolutely. I think cost as well is quite a big issue for retailers, because at the moment they're really being squeezed by the terrible conditions in the high street, and cloud technology is seen, I think, as a cheaper alternative to having your own data center, which can be very capital heavy.
Yes, it can, and I think you also have to think a little bit about governance as well, because self-service doesn't mean a free-for-all. If you don't have any governance around it, I've had a lot of customers talk about the fact that the virtual server is something that they can very easily provision very quickly, and it's seen as cheap or almost free. And what tends to happen is you start to run many more virtual or cloud servers than you would in the normal environment. So that governance of who can do what and what those servers are doing and when they need to be turned off is also very important to hit that cost point.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So effectively, prospective customers should be asking what safeguards are in place, things like rollback capability, or whether there's an enterprise-grade SLA in place. And in terms of the process of automation, then, we're not saying that it's an either-or proposition. Automation is complemented by human interaction and that level of upfront consultancy. So when people are approaching the cloud, presumably there need to be business rules on the customer side as well, and authority established around who has permission to make changes. How's that implemented?
Well, the majority of customers do expect that level of control in the change management process, especially who actions the changes from the business side through their IT staff, through to the service provider, how that gets vetted, how that gets assessed, and how that gets actioned thereafter. The whole process is very important, and I think that the customer wants as many safeguards with the service provider as their own, so they don't really want to leave it to the last hurdle as being on their end. They would like someone to sanity check what changes going in, whether it will affect themselves or whether it will affect anyone else on a multi-tenant environment.
Of course, using an intelligent portal can allow you to help enforce some of those governance rules to make sure that only the correct people that should be doing the more advanced tasks can get access to do those things. When those types of tasks, or in fact any type of task is requested, or any service is requested, that the system is tracked and audited, so who asked for it, who approved it, when was it implemented, when did it go live, and what's the life cycle of whatever that object was that was delivered and when it should be shut down.
Exactly that.
And you spoke earlier about the responsiveness that retailers can gain through this kind of mechanism, but what do you feel needs to happen between, let's say, for example, the marketing side of the business looking to deploy a campaign, expecting an uplift in traffic? There still needs to be an interface with IT to manage that process.
Yes, absolutely. No, there needs to be a good line of communication between the internal IT with the retailer and then their external provider as well. They need to be able to call them at any time of the day or night, because retailers can work very unsocial hours in the evenings and weekends. So yeah, I think that they do need to be able to have that line of connection, as you said earlier, to actually be able to pick up the phone and speak to somebody on the other end, and not to have the whole process automated via email and that kind of thing, which can seem quite impersonal.
Yeah, and it's keeping each other informed to the service provider, even if they've got ideas that they want to do on a business application, which could not only ramp up the compute resource, but the underlying storage I/O, which is primarily a foundation of any infrastructure. So by talking to the service provider and being able to, kind of make some plans and provisions, they can work alongside the business to be able to allow them to run a very intensive process at that time. So that can only be done by really interacting with someone and explaining to them how that business application or that requirement is going to affect.
Sure.
The
From the service side, but again from the offering side, I would imagine the portal plays a big part in being able to offer those what are normally technical services in a way that the business can understand them, describe them in a way very much like Apple does with a lot of their technologies, make it easy for consumers to use. So describe it in a way that the business consumer or the target customer is actually going to use it and doesn't have to know all of the technology underneath it to drive the return on investment that the customer is looking for.
Sure. Because there are so many different types of technologies now that retailers are using to actually at work, say smartphones, tablets, things like that, and there's still a lot of regulations about how can they access their applications in the cloud. Can they do that through a smartphone? Can they do that through a tablet? And if they want to be able to, then they have to choose a provider accordingly.
Sure.
And presumably you'd be looking for an enterprise grade provider who's offering the kind of service that will be shared by like-minded enterprises rather than, for example, startup businesses.
Yes, also you wouldn't just necessarily want to kind of direct to a certain type of business. You would have safeguards in place on an infrastructure to not allow any, contention in any way across a shared infrastructure at all. But yes, like-minded companies, but there's also the demand for companies to be able to change and evolve. So it's a case of not one size fits all, and not we don't kind of direct to just one sort of kind of level of company. So it could be from low to high end, whatever it can be. So.
Sure, and we see a number of service providers who really adopt that flexibility, even though they may be using portals and orchestration tools. The customer, for example, could load up their own image of their test and dev for Java, and then be able to clone that in the cloud rather than being forced to use the service provider's own standard that you then have to apply your patches and everything else to. So we're seeing a lot of that kind of flexibility and openness.
So what we're saying essentially is that automation doesn't come at the expense of customer service. In a way, it's a bit like visiting an ATM if you just simply want to withdraw cash. And there are other times when you'll want to sit down with your bank manager and have a more involving discussion. Well, that brings us to the end of today's discussion, and we're now going to move on to look at questions from the audience that have come in. The first one is, what do you believe constitutes good support from a cloud provider? There's a broad question.
Well, good support from a cloud provider will be not only being absolutely available at any time through a 24-hour period and 7 days a week and across the year, is to be able to kind of understand every single underlying issue, if there are any of a customer, and any kind of request, and being able to translate that into a requirement. So whether in-house you'd have your teams of expertise, so wherever a customer has got an issue, you would escalate to the appropriate teams and be there for them, and giving responses. So it's being responsive and being able to action something to help a business.
I would say it's one that can help a retailer achieve the goals, their business goals. Like, because it's a multi-channel world now. You've got online, you've got in-store as well, but a lot of retailers have both, and they might want to expand their web capabilities. They might want to open new stores. They might want to open new stores in different countries. And it's a provider that can actually support and help them do that.
Yeah, and so linking to what you're saying, I think is around a provider that will also innovate. The provider is the technical expert, and therefore as newer technologies, we've been talking about compute and automation, as more innovative technologies come out, and there are many, you want a service provider that would actually adopt those and bring those to you as a business solution. So a simple one might be, you're doing infrastructure as a service, and the service provider is now providing you a workplace on demand where you can bring your tablets, and it removes the cost of the desktop refresh and going to the latest version of Windows. Costly exercise for a retailer with the number of people that they have.
Yeah.
And the next question, I want to move my development environment to a shared cloud infrastructure. Should I be concerned that I've been offered automated support?
Well, that can, depending on how vital the development environment is. Now, development can be spin up, tear down kind of environment for a very small team which haven't got any SLAs ultimately or anything really, behind the, recovering that data as such. But some companies regard their development environment as production because they invest heavily into the developers themselves. So any minute of downtime costs them money because they're paying developers to sit there and not being able to work. So it's all depends on what the end user requires from a support perspective. If they don't really require a real tight SLA, then self-service is a good way to go. But also, if they do require a real tight SLA like production, I would treat it as a bit of semi-production.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a balance of needs and resources.
Yes.
I mean, some of the automated tools can be very good, like you get a chat window where you can actually talk to someone relatively quickly without waiting in a queue. That can be quite a good experience for some things, but not necessarily for production environment. Through to being able to pick up the big red phone and talk to someone because something's gone horribly wrong. You've got to balance with what you're looking for from that provider and what works for you. There's some automated solutions, almost robotic solutions, that I wouldn't suggest companies use for a production environment, for example.
Yeah, I think for retailers it's definitely a balancing act. It's a mixture of the two. They want a level of automation that allows them to innovate within their in-house IT team, but they also want a level of support as well, and they may want to be able to manage their own applications within the cloud. It really depends on the business, to be honest.
Yeah, I guess it's a question of matching your as-is to your to-be and making sure that the business is not impacted.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to our panel, and just time now to give you the results from our earlier poll. 27% of our audience say that security is their primary concern with regard to self-service provisioning. So thank you everybody for participating and taking part in the poll, and thank you for attending. We hope you found today's discussion informative. A video of the webinar will be available to watch on demand on the 2020 Webinars website, and you can also sign up there for further webinars in the series. So you'll find that at www.2020webinars.com. The next webinar in our series is From Legacy to Leading, and that will happen at 2 p.m. GMT on Thursday, the 12th of April. So we very much hope you'll join us then. Thank you and goodbye.